Ooh, season two. We got another great one for season two. All right, joining me today is Doctor. We'll say it again, Jonathan Solomon, a husband, mentor. And one thing I read is that you wrote your dissertation on the experiences of academically gifted African American men at HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities. And that, to me, works perfect for today's episode, which is the importance of an HBCU. Um, so, first and foremost, thank you for coming. Thank you for being here, giving energy, time, and experience. I usually started off one positive thing, one negative thing to keep it balanced. So talk to us. Give us one positive thing going on right now.
Oh man, yeah. So thank you for allowing me to be in the space, man. I appreciate it. And I appreciate what you're doing with this space. So definitely looking forward to conversation. One positive thing I would say, um, I have recently, within the last year or so, like reconnected a lot with nature, and so I've been trying to just be outside a little bit more. And I think the weather was good enough today to start the day off with a hike. So met up with one of my friends, went on a hike, brought the dog out, and so that does wonders for my mental health and all of those things. And so definitely say that's a positive thing. Uh, a negative thing, I'm not experiencing too many negatives right now.
Yeah.
But one thing that I will say is that I've been in a constant battle with trying to find that balance between work being the thing that you're passionate about, but letting work be work. And so not allowing work to bleed over into personal life and finding that balance. And so I think it's something I'm doing a good job with right now. But it sometimes it trickles back in, and I have to like regroup and remind myself that that's not going to be my identity or something that I'm going to let bleed over into my personal life.
Yeah, that's. I'm glad you brought that up too. The mental health, mental and emotional health, because that's the foundation of it all, in my opinion. From the coping skills to the affirmations you tell yourself, as well as how you get through, tumultuous times and traumatic times. So
Absolutely.
that's. I'm glad you shared something that somebody can take in. Is nature, reading, writing, cooking, having conversations like these, drawing, whatever you have and you enjoy, is use it to your benefit. Okay, the topic we said HBCUs, but what is it? What is an HBCU?
Yeah, yeah. So this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And so HBCUs, you probably have heard the term, but it is an acronym for Historically Black Colleges and Universities. And so these are institutions that were created during a time when Black folks. So first off, Black folks have always believed in education. It's been something that's been central to the being of who we are. But we were at a time in our country where Black Americans could not gain admission into colleges and universities across the country. And so they were created as institutions that would be for Black people so that they didn't have to admit us into what we call as predominantly or historically white institutions. And so got very humble beginnings. There's over 100 institutions that are still active right now all across the country. But yeah, they began as places where Black people can pursue higher education, be in community with each other, and really kind of experience that training to go out and be better humans, better prepared for whatever fields they wanted to go into, all of those things.
That's excellent. So now let's talk to the sophomore, eighth grader, maybe the senior in high school. They have options. They say, I want to maybe entrepreneurship, maybe getting my a trade, or I could go to a college. So they say, I understand what it was, the HBCU, historically black. I understand what it was, but with it being 2022, why should I go to it? Why is it important to me?
That's a great question. So I think my first point of advice that I would give somebody, who is exploring their options at that point, is to continue exploring your options. Really trying to get a good sense into what the things that you feel strongly led to, what you feel passionate about, and those things change over time. But I think it's important to continue doing that, specifically in terms of HBCUs and why they would be important to look into for somebody who's in high school. um, these are, I think when it comes to college, like if you're looking for an experience where you're going to be academically prepared, you're going to get the credential that you need. A lot of times when people are thinking about, oh, I want to be in this field of work, or if I'm thinking about business and I want to be an entrepreneur in the future, that there's a certain level of training that a college degree offers, and I think that it also speaks to your ability to commit to something, and I think that's still important within the workforce at this point. And so, being able to find an institution that is going to prepare you academically, but also I think HBCUs have really been known for like preparing folks academically, but also having that social push that is important. And so being immersed in our culture, seeing people that look like us be successful, struggling alongside people and building community in that type of way. And I think for me, so I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio. I graduated high school in Los Angeles. And so back in Cleveland, most of the schools I went to were Black. And so like I never really kind of like considered race as a big thing because I was surrounded by Black people. It was just like, oh, this is just who we are. And when I moved to California, it was a much more diverse environment. I started to think about, okay, I can feel when I stand out as being Black. And at that time was in a gifted and talented program, was playing sports. And so all of those things were salient. But when I went off to Langston University in Oklahoma, and I went on a football scholarship, I think arriving on campus, I immediately was able to kind of see that, the professors were Black. And these were folks who were allowing me to use their car to go to the store. These were folks who, if you were not showing up to class or you were not, putting forth your best effort in ways that they knew that you could, they were going to push you a little bit more. And as someone who graduated from both an HBCU and a PWI, two PWIs after that, it was just a different experience. And I think that was something that I needed. And a lot of us need like that, that you're going to get the academic preparation and that you're going to get a social life. But having people who are invested in you and look like you so that that the things that you're aspiring to, they are believable because you see it firsthand. You see these folks doing it and being it.
Oh man, you mentioned it, representation, because a lot of things we see, a lot of things we do, we see before. And so to that child, because I grew up on Langston's campus, and to show how small the world is, you used to actually be my upward bound counselor.
Sure did.
At Langston, and this is beautiful how things like that work. So just for me looking at it, and this is me talking to that senior, to that eighth grader, I've went to both as well, and this is how I would describe it. The HBCU is more of a community. It's more cohesion, to where you do get that higher level of accountability, that assistance you might need, that help, that structure that they know you need. You just don't realize it yet. So it's more invested when it comes to. Because I went to UCO, University of Central Oklahoma, and there it was more business. It was a little bit more paperwork, intentional, to the point. You don't get it right, consequences. You don't get that right, then it's time for you to find something else. Whereas Langston is, well, let's have a conversation about it. Let's be a lot more invested, because UCO was still invested. Don't get me wrong, but it's a different feel, texture to it. That's how I would describe it. So you got to Langston, but what made you champion it? Because you can write your dissertation over anything, but you champion the HBCU. So explain to us why.
Yeah. So my dissertation. So just for folks who maybe aren't super familiar with like dissertations, so I recently completed my PhD. So I got a doctorate degree in education, and my dissertation, the book that you have to write at the end, the title of it is, gifted. It really focuses on academically gifted Black men at HBCUs. And I think some of that came from my own experience, being someone who, as a youngster, had experience being in gifted and talented programs, and counselors and teachers not really talking about HBCUs, or if they did, it was always in a negative light, as them being less than. And so really having to make my own decision and figure out, like look at resources in my own way because it wasn't being taught at my school. And so when I got to my campus, the experience I had at Langston really was foundational to who I am at this point. And so coming in as someone who I knew that I was already academically strong. And so that, I was looking for a challenge in the classroom, just to kind of be prepared. But some of the things that I didn't know, like we didn't talk about what it meant to be Black and like how you show up as a Black person in different spaces. And I think what I was able to get out of the Langston experience as being a student leader, representing the university as a student athlete, and then after my athletic career ended, being highly involved in student government and some other organizations on campus, I was really able to get mentors and hear from folks about how, like being Black, we don't have to operate in a deficit model. A lot of times when I'm on campuses, and I've worked at historically white institutions too, a lot of the times the feel from folks is that like, oh, we're Black, we got to work twice as hard. Like we benefit from handouts and all those types of things. And I don't think that that's something that is like happening everywhere, but a lot of times in the spaces that I was a part of, that was happening. And I think at Langston, it really taught me that because we've entered these spaces, because we like work at these businesses and we've gotten jobs and placement, we've worked twice as hard to get there so that we're more deserving than anyone. And so this whole concept of imposter syndrome is something that, I think we still struggle with. Like as people, everyone is going to deal with imposter syndrome. But I oftentimes reflect on my experience at Langston in the ways that my professors and mentors and peers said, like, bro, like you've got into these spaces and you never got a handout to get into these spaces. Like you didn't have the family wealth to get you to these spaces. You didn't have the flashy preparation in those ways. And what that says about you is that you've worked harder than anyone else in this space. And so you deserve to be in this space even more. And I think that like having that frame of mind was something that I got at Langston. And I hear a lot of time when I'm talking to other HBCU alums and people invested in HBCUs is that those are institutions that instill that in you because we care about you that much. Like we instill that level of confidence in you in who you are, in your Blackness, and how you show up to spaces so that you can show up as your authentic self and know that like that space is yours because you got there off of your merit and your accomplishments in the work that you put in. So I think that's what I immediately got when I got to campus. And it happened over time. And also it took some time for me, like once I graduated, I needed to reflect on that because I do think that because HBCUs are historically underfunded by state governments and, have to battle for resources. There were some like challenges on campus throughout my time. And so I remember like people always talking about financial aid. And I was like, where's my refund check? Like, why am I not getting that at the beginning of the semester? Like my friends who were at UCO and OU and OSU. But it took me like being a student leader, understanding why those things were happening and that they weren't always on our institutions. We have institutions, Langston was serving 75% low income and first generation students. And so there are governmental things that happen, whereas our institutions are affected by them. But yeah, like owning all of those things and really feeling like I got to push to be confident in who I am is kind of what I walked away from after I graduated from the institution.
I want you to walk us through both doors. Walk us through some of the trials and tribulations and triumphant moments of the more, I believe it was the University of Oklahoma, and then the Langston University. Kind of take us through both doors without us having to step through them physically.
Yeah, absolutely. So like both, when you say trials and tribulation, you want me to focus on like the negative, like challenging experiences that I've had?
Absolutely. Like maybe the lowest point and the highest point of both.
Yeah. So I went to the University of Oklahoma for graduate school. Got my master's there, and I just finished at Indiana State University with my PhD. So had both of those experiences. And in terms of some of the highs, man, I'm a sports guy, so I love the passion for the institution, being able to be a part of an institution that has big time sports. I think that the culture is great. People like are excited about the institution, and there's a lot of money pumping through. And so when I went off to OU, some of the things that I was really grateful for was just the number of different programs that were offered. I was someone who was in the higher education student affairs program, but I was at the time I was thinking about being a college athletic director. And so being at OU meant that I had an opportunity to work with big time sports and really get a sense of like, is this something that I want to be a part of? But there was just money everywhere. There was money for different things. I remember walking around campus and like we had an app for free food. And so like other students would tell you like when free food was happening, and so like those types of things, there's just so much money. There's so many ways to find money on those types of campuses. And that was something I was really grateful for. In terms of some of the things that I really struggled with was my Black identity in a lot of ways. And so knowing that you're at an institution where there are not a ton of people who look like you, that historically excluded you because of the fundamental of who you are and how you show up, and just struggling to make sense with that, knowing that, a lot of times the classmates don't even know you, but don't think that you're qualified to be in that space or think that you may have got admitted into the space because of affirmative action or something like that, which Black people have historically not benefited from affirmative action, but that's another whole conversation. But just knowing that you have the weight of carrying your community in a space like that, like professors will look at you expecting you to speak for all Black people or to bring your Black experience to the space, and knowing that they also capitalize off of that. So thinking about, sports, you have all these Black bodies on campus, and I think we're getting better now with paying student athletes, but the institution is benefiting off of Black bodies, and so I think that especially my first year, I struggled because I didn't have the community that I was used to having at Langston. And I think it was at Langston, I didn't need to search out for the community. Like it was literally around me. And so even if I didn't want to say, oh, I'm going to join a club, like Blackness was around me and I couldn't escape it. So that was just a great thing that I experienced. And at OU, it wasn't until my second year that I said, you know what, I need to find my community. And so I joined the Black Graduate Student Association there. And that was exactly what I needed. Like it was folks who look like me, who we could have a space where we talk about, what it means to be Black in these white spaces, because that is also important, like taking up space. And just being able to kind of reflect on our experiences and build each other up and do things that feel good to us. And so like, we knew that the programs on campus weren't necessarily geared towards Black people. And so we brought our own sense of self to campus and did things that made us feel good. We would have like spades nights at the time. Watching Scandal was big. And so we would all come together and watch Scandal. And, just doing things that for us as Black people was important in terms of building community. And so like, I would say, that experience, I still think I had an overall positive experience attending the PWI. It just looked different. And I knew that I wouldn't feel as tied to the institution in terms of my identity and what I care about as much because the institution had not been historically created for someone like me. And in terms of my Langston experience, I think it was a little bit of the opposite. I feel extremely connected to the institution because of its history and why it operates today. And so like the work that it's doing in Oklahoma, what Langston has meant to Black Oklahoma history. I remember coming to campus and there were a couple of things I had never heard of. I had never heard of Black Wall Street, so didn't know what that was. And I also didn't know that Black people lived in Oklahoma. And so I was just like, oh, I know I'm going to this black school in Oklahoma, but I feel like Oklahoma is like 99% white. And that just was not the case. I didn't know about the history of black towns in Oklahoma. And I think that it just, as someone who came in with aspirations of being a history teacher, I quickly learned how much of history had been ignored and erased from my experience. And so like, it just had me like wanting to like find new knowledge, all this knowledge that had been kept from me in my own books in schools that I thought that, were invested in me in that type of way. So yeah, I think just like learning about Black history and just like Black history within our states, within the system, and all those types of things was great. And I would say some of the trials, I think like having to experience, like being at an institution that was under-resourced meant that we didn't have as many options. And so on campus, the dining options were not, we didn't have like 12 restaurants like some other schools. And like when I was playing football, I remember us kind of like struggling to get books. So as a student athlete, I was supposed to have like access to these books and all that type of stuff and not have to pay for it. But because we were like under resources and they were really making it do with what they had, like there were some times where I had to share some materials with like other classmates and stuff like that. And during that time, like I was frustrated. I'm just like, no, this is not how it's supposed to be. And I have friends that, I spent a lot of time at OSU. So I have friends who are having a very different experience in terms of those things. But in what they were lacking, I was getting out of Langston. And I think that it just made me appreciate our institutions even more. Like knowing that they're experiencing these challenges from the state, like they're getting underfunded by millions and millions of dollars and still finding a way to create this transformational experience for students who a lot of times don't come from homes where everyone went to college or there's a ton of money. So I think those are kind of like pros and cons in terms of some of the things that I experienced during my time in college.
And that's what we needed. That's what we needed. And I appreciate you for sharing. You talked about imposter syndrome, mental and emotional health, being around people who resemble you for that experience. Talk to us about why is this important to the psyche? Why is it important to the subconscious?
Yeah. So I will say that I've learned that imposter syndrome shows up all the time. And so like, even no matter how far you think that you've made it, you can still battle with imposter syndrome. And I think that it's important to be surrounded by folks who either like look like you, or maybe you experience imposter syndrome in terms of the ideas you have. And so like being in a space where folks are thinking creatively like you, I think all of that just kind of reminds you that you're not crazy, that you are like, you can show up in the ways that you feel most, true to yourself in those types of ways. And so for me, I think the biggest sources of imposter syndrome that I've experienced have been being Black, like being in spaces that are aggressively white, and feeling like I couldn't show up as my true self in those spaces. And so like having to code switch, having to change the way I talk, having to, not, just like not bring my full self to the table. And I think I've also experienced some imposter syndrome as someone who grew up extremely poor, being in spaces where people that was not their experience. And so one of my experiences I talk about a lot in graduate school, I remember that I was presenting and I had a professor who looked like me, who was Black, in the middle of my presentation told me to stop speaking in slang. And for me, that was like demoralizing in a lot of ways because like Black language and Black vernacular is not respected. I think we respect all these different languages and dialects from other people, but a lot of times just the way that Black people talk and the way that Black people show up, and also just like the regional differences. So as being someone from Ohio, like there may be certain ways that I say different things in a very different way. And so to think that I was in a space where I knew that I was qualified to be in, but the very foundation of who I am, the way that I talk, I was being told to not do that. And it was in a room full of white folks. That was demoralizing for me. And I think it made me take a step back. It almost made me like want to drop out of the program. It's like I feel like an imposter. Like, how did I get into this program? How did I get into this space? Did I fool people in getting in here? And so, again, I think that's why community is important, because I was able to go to some other Black folks and be like, yo, and even before I said anything, they were like, yo, that was wrong. Like, that was absolutely wrong. People who had my back in that situation and felt like it was wrong. And I think for me, that also kind of influenced my dissertation, like why I wanted to focus on Blackness and be able to amplify the voices of gifted Black men who maybe don't look like they are quote unquote gifted, or don't talk like they're quote unquote gifted, but are gifted in many different ways. And so, yeah, I think it inspired my work. It inspired me to just like tap into who I am even more and to show up how I show up even more, because there are so many other people who are being told that, you can't walk like this, you can't talk like this, you can't grow your locks out and be professional. You can't do this and that. And if I can just show up as myself, hopefully I'm inspiring other people who may be having challenges to how they show up and how they present themselves, and know that you can find success, traditional success in these spaces, and still look and sound and be you fully.
And as you're talking about it, I get flashbacks to when I went to UCO, the predominantly Caucasian, predominantly white, and it is a challenge, especially when you have other African American students in class. How much do you give? And do you sit in the back of the room quietly and get things done? How aggressively do you ask your questions, and how do you present yourself in class? Do you sit in the front? Do you sit in the middle? And so I definitely understand, and without realizing that, I suffer some of those same things as well. How much to give, and how often to give it is how I would sum it up.
Mm-hmm.
Imposter syndrome, and correct me if I'm wrong. I'm gonna put it in like a high school or middle school term. Is when other people think you should be a way versus the way you naturally are,
Yep,
and that disconnect and finding that balance.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So I definitely get that as well. And I hate that, like, we have to internally battle with those things. It's just like, how should I show up? Like, should I speak up? Should I do this? Should I do that? And I think that we experience that in ways that a lot of other people don't. And it's extra weight that like is added to our experience on top of you just being a good student, like you handling your business. You also have to think about like how you present and how you show up. And that's just an extra weight that none of us asked for, but like given who we are, as Black people, like we're going to experience it. And so one thing that I had to tell myself too, like I got to a point where I was like, you know what, I'm not carrying that weight no more. I don't want to do that anymore. But like I respect the fact that like we have had to do that as a way of survival, because it is true. We've had to think about those things because we are in spaces that were not made for us, and like have suffered violence in these types of spaces before. So it is a method of survival, and I respect that. But I acknowledge it as an extra weight that none of us signed up to carry. But that is a part of the Black experience, especially when we're in white spaces. And I think even professionally, that's something I experienced too. As someone who worked in higher education for 10 years, worked at a number of different institutions, the only time I've ever worked at a place where I felt like I could fully be myself and not have to worry about like how I position myself was working at HBCU. And so I worked at Harris-Stowe State University in St. Louis, and really enjoyed that experience because I felt like I showed up as myself every day, and that was valuable. Like the students connected with me because of that. Like staff members loved me because of that. And I walked away and I didn't feel exhausted from like having to have a mask on all day. And so like it's just interesting, like these spaces that we've created, and that's why like HBCUs are so important, is because like even on the professional side, like they're almost like safe havens for our community, for us to really be able to be ourselves and be trained on like what that looks like, and not have to worry about just being like being called out for not showing up and answering a question a certain way. So yeah, I feel that's something I've experienced too. So
How do we take that same type of context and culture back to the community? We know it's here at the HBCU. We know it's here. How do we bridge like a stable pipeline and connection to the community that it seeks to serve?
absolutely. Well, I think the first thing that we have to do is ask the question, like, in these spaces, this works because. And so when I think about like in these spaces, we found success in like being connected with each other in a lot of ways, understanding the power that we have, and utilizing that. And so like we've realized that because like we've set aside these spaces and these things have worked in that type of way, like now that we know why they work, it's even more reason for us to take it into the community. And so for me, I think one thing that I've always kind of thought about in terms of just like us as Black people and like how we're able to continue to push the culture forward in whatever ways that means is we have to recognize that being Black is not a monolith. And so the way that we show up as Black people, maybe here can look completely different. And so there's a lot of diversity within Blackness, and we have to make space for that. And so just understanding that there are some Black people who are going to be incredibly pro-Black, and that we need to be able to have space for them. There are some Black people who have not been around other Black people who are not going to present and talk and act in the ways that a lot of us associate Blackness with. We need space for them. There are Black people, there are cisgender heterosexual Black people who present in traditional ways, and there are LGBTQ plus Black people, and we need space for all of us to come together. And I think that's one of the things that we struggle with within our community at this point, is like defining the Black agenda as something that's all encompassing and not appreciating the diversity within Blackness. Like appreciating that first so that we can all come together and love and move forward. And I say that in a way, I also want to say, like, I feel like us as a culture, we've done a great job of like coming together. And so there are flourishing like Black communities. There are flourishing Black businesses that folks have invested in. There are flourishing Black cities. Like those things are here, but we don't hear about those enough. We hear about the negative stuff. And so it's almost like, we've been conditioned to have this deficit mindset to think that, being Black means something negative, or like we're not doing, or we're lacking. And that's not the case. And so I think the reality of the matter is like understanding that we are not lacking. How do we amplify Black folks that are doing great work? You're doing great work. There are a number of even in the state of Oklahoma, I'm thinking about, there are a number of fantastic Black businesses that are having a lot of success. Like, how do we continue to support those movements? And like while doing that and while supporting the things that are, that are having a great amount of success, acknowledging where our shortcomings are, and working on those to continue bringing them up. And so there's still a super high number of Black folks who live in poverty and experience, poverty as it is. And that's a structural issue in the United States that goes much deeper than us as Black people just saying, oh, like, we can't live in poverty no more. Like, this country is literally created to benefit off of Black bodies and to keep us in poverty, And so, like, working on a structural front, like from elected working to support Black elected officials who have Black issues in mind, and like continuing to push, supporting them in their fight, because they are fighting a racist system. And just like acknowledging that as something that's important, I think it's going to be important for us to be able to continue, like, pull some of what is happening on HBCU campuses, all this, excellence and greatness and all these things, to continue to happen within our community and outside of those spaces. Because, honestly and truthfully, Black people need to be everywhere. We need to be in all different types of spaces, and there's room for Black people to be everywhere. We just have to celebrate that even more than we do now.
Yeah. I mean, you touched on a lot there, from the public officials who have our best interest. And we actually talked about that in a previous episode, the pros and cons of law school with Lorenzo Banks. And he talked about how we don't vote. We want things to change. We have a plan, and then he'll and his team and people that are similar to what he's doing to say, go vote for this person because you want this to change. This is the person that is best for the situation. And then we won't show up. And so that's what one thing I ask every guest is, how do we unify that? And some of the things that's come so far is the one of the most influential institutions in the community is the Black church.
Yeah.
So somehow getting with them, having that conversation within that context, and then the entertainment as well, the music, the videos, the films. Having a quote, I was told you can tell somebody why they're wrong for 30 minutes, or you can tell somebody why you're right for 30 minutes. So to provide the solution instead of pointing out that this is wrong for the same amount of time. And so that's what I'm learning to do now. With music is a huge catalyst, especially for the younger generation, to kind of introduce exactly what we're saying now, except over a beat that they rock to.
Mm-hmm.
And so these are the types of questions that I'm asking. These are the types of things that I'm seeing. You said something. I've championed the Black inferiority complex in combating it. You talked about how the phrase, the feeling of African American Black is almost a slight. It's almost a negative term, a derogative term. I want you to explain to people from your educational experience, what is the Black inferiority complex?
Yeah, so to me, and I think we all probably experience it in different ways. When I think about the Black inferiority complex, I think about really like growing up being told that Black was negative, that being Black meant that you were less than, and just going through these stages of Black identity development. For me, like hearing that as a youngster, and then seeing that in action in terms of where I saw money being distributed, and so like Black communities being more poverty-riven, being more crime-riven, than communities where I saw more white people and other people. And so like for me, like I went through those stages, especially as a kid, where I was just like, yo, like everyone is telling me either like they're saying it with their mouths or they are displaying it with their actions, that being Black is second class in a lot of ways. And I think that we also do get to a point where we can begin to internalize those types of things. And so if we hear these negative stereotypes about Blackness, and we see these stereotypes playing out in our day-to-day, we can internalize that and have internal challenges with our Blackness, like right in the midst of it. And I think for me, really how I have worked to combat that is, one, understanding that as Black people, we are a subset of the general society. And so poverty is not only a Black issue. Are Black people affected by poverty? Absolutely. And I think it's systematic, and there is a lot of work to be done on that front. That's something that, so many generations of Black folks have experienced in this country because of slavery, Jim Crow, just historic practices to keep Black people not accumulating wealth in a lot of different ways. And I have worked to combat that and saying like that is both something that like within our community we need to work on, but also like that is something in a lot of ways that has happened to us that like we need to be pushing for reparations for. So like because we have been systematically excluded and affected by these different type of ways, there's work for the general system that the general system needs to do, and that's not something that I need to own completely. And so, yeah, I think for me, it's just like these messages, it's media, it's what we've experienced as Black people, hearing and seeing that Black is second class, that it is not great. It's associated with negativeness, and the ways in which when you hear that so much and you see in your personal spaces some of the negative stereotypes that people are saying, you can begin to internalize those things and feel that way about your Blackness. And a lot of times I see it show up in the ways that, we show up, like us not appreciating and loving like Black features. And so like beauty standards, it's associated with, like, I remember growing up, and especially for young Black boys, and that's a whole other conversation about like masculinity and learning masculinity and manhood. But like your attraction begins to be something that is not Black. And so I remember as a youngster, it's just like, oh, like I want something exotic, or I want something, closer to white, because for me, I've been conditioned to think that means success. That means money, and not even realizing that like my own thoughts have become anti-Black. And I'm disassociating my humanity because of what I've been conditioned to think means something greater. And so that's something that I've also championed, is like beginning to have those conversations within our community, to ask ourselves, like, why do we think like that? When did it first happen? So that we can really uncover the reasons why those thoughts have come up, so that we can move better together as a community. And so I think that's just something in terms of Black inferiority complex that has definitely shown up in my life. And I think that the more that I've moved away from that and realized like what Blackness truly means, and how resilient we've been, and how powerful we are as a people, and how beautiful we are as a people, how intelligent we are as a people, and all of those things, the true essence of Blackness, it has made me appreciate being Black even more. And I think that's why being Black has been like my salient identity. It's the thing that I'm attached to most, because I know that it's something that folks have actively worked for me to hate. Like society, the media has actively wanted me to hate the very fiber of who I am. And that's why I love it so much more, because of how resilient we've been to really understand like what Blackness truly means.
And it starts with conversations like these, to where you start to address the trauma. I feel like that's a major key. How do we support our HBCUs? Do they need money, volunteers? Do they need advocates to write the state legislators on their behalf? How can we support this institution that means so much to us in our progress moving forward?
Absolutely. So they need it all. All of these things. And a couple of the points that you mentioned that I think are important in terms of sticking out. For parents who are thinking about like where to send their children, I would push that you highly consider HBCUs. Again, there are over 100 institutions. And so a lot of times within our community, I hear, like some of the institutions don't have a ton of scholarship options, or they're super expensive. I would push you to research more HBCUs, because a lot of times our private institutions are more expensive, and they do have scholarship options, but sometimes you have to look for them. And so a lot of times when those conversations come up, you hear folks talking about like the Morehouse, the Spelman, the Howard, the Hampton, some of those institutions and their price tag. But there are the Langstons, the Lincoln University of Missouri, the Lane College, the Stillman College, the Central State, the Kentucky State, institutions that are probably the most affordable institutions in their state. And so when you think about being able to afford those institutions, I push people to send their kids to HBCUs because they know that they're going to be cared for. It's a financially conscious decision. But also there's a ton of scholarship options. And so one of my mentees recently graduated high school in the St. Louis area and was a valedictorian of his class. And I kept pushing him. I was like, hey, like, we're going to get you a full scholarship to HBCU. And at the time, he was applying to a lot of different schools. But I told him to apply to Langston and to apply to the McCabe Scholar Program, which is 4 years, fully funded, tuition, fees, housing, food, all of those things. And he applied and he got it. And so he's going to school for free. So understanding that in terms of school choice, like knowing that these institutions do have resources and do have financial resources for students who are looking for scholarships, but we have to look beyond just those household names of HBCUs that we've heard, which are great, fantastic institutions, but there are other smaller public land grant institutions that do have financial assistance. Also, I just think like speaking about the greatness of HBCUs in your general spaces is something that is important to continue educating people about our institutions. And so if you're someone who is working at a business, I encourage you to ask your business, your HR office, where are our interns coming from? Like, are we advertising internships at HBCUs? Do we have pipeline programs where we're trying to bring in more students of color? Are we advertising those at HBCUs? If you're someone who's connected to politics, pushing our politicians to talk about HBCUs and the funding crisis that is happening. Just recently, I heard about a group of students at Florida A&M, FAMU, who are suing the state of Florida for millions of dollars in funds that were illegally kept from FAMU. And so again, this is examples of our institutions operating with less. It has happened in the state of Oklahoma. Millions of dollars have been withheld from Langston University by the state of Oklahoma. It happened in OKC, it happened at the main campus, and it happened in Tulsa. And so if our institutions had the money that they were rightfully owed, then they would be doing a great job. And it takes us talking about that, and it takes us advocating for our institutions. Even if you didn't go to HBCU, you can ask your state legislators, your Congress people, like, what are we doing to right the wrong that has happened at Black schools? Like, why are Black schools receiving less funding for the students that they have? So I think like talking about HBCUs and spaces, sending your children, showing up, come to homecoming. If you're in Oklahoma, October 22nd, I'll be there. I'm flying in from St. Louis. But just being in those types of spaces, being able to experience our community coming together and supporting each other and cheering for each other, I think is great as well. So those are just a couple of different ways folks can support HBCUs. But any way that you think possible, I think our institutions would really appreciate it. And in turn, Black students will appreciate it. These are Black people who make up these institutions, and they would appreciate that.
I've noticed a certain context and narrative when it really comes to anything Black owned. Well, for example, Black owned business, maybe they got the order wrong. Maybe something happened with communication, and then they completely, this is why I don't. It automatically goes to, this is why I don't. See, that's why you can't. But when they go to somewhere else that's Caucasian owned or another ethnicity, they get that benefit of the doubt. Mm-hmm. And so I challenge us to be more patient with each other, to be more caring and understanding with each other, and to be open to that communication instead of completely writing off. And then now you have the derogative feedback. Still hold them accountable, but right. Then give them that chance to make it right, instead of completely writing them off and then spreading that propaganda so quickly, so effortlessly, almost.
Yeah. I think it really, you have to extend the same amount of grace that you do to others, and understand that a lot of times, and I do that even. I remember being that person. It was like, oh, like, why, I'm putting all this money to Black-owned businesses. Like, I expect my service to be a certain way. But, like, I was extending grace in other businesses that I was not in my own. And so, like, calling that out within yourself and correcting that wrong and extending that grace, I think you'll truly benefit it from, and all of us will benefit, in that type of way because of that.
I want you to talk to the people. Where can they find you? What are you working on? Share something with us. What can we expect from you?
Absolutely, man. So, working on a lot of different things right now. The easiest way to connect with me would be my website. So, www.drjonathansolomon.com. Jonathan is JONATHANSOLOMON. That's a great way to connect, and it has some links to like my social media, which I'm super active on. Right now, I professionally I transitioned to working in tech. Back in November. I'm loving it. So I've been working from home, doing some great work in terms of helping HBCUs and other minority serving institutions understand how the use of technology could really help them in leveling the playing field and providing great outcomes for their students, especially those who are historically marginalized, students of color, in those types of ways. And so I also do a lot of consulting, and so helping companies, others talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, and what that means, and what it means for different spaces, but also just like anti-racism tactics and how we utilize them at different corporations, businesses. And, I think at the very core of what I'm doing is I'm trying to make any space that Black people are able to be in one where they can thrive. And so doing a lot of that and also doing a lot of undoing patriarchy work. So just talking about what it means to be a man and like elements of toxic masculinity and how we all as men can do better for our own sake, for the sake of the people that we harm and when we don't do better, and just generally like mental health. That's something that I've been really big on and like talking through the trauma that I've experienced, as a kid who navigated the foster care syndrome, lived in homelessness, and have had some other traumas, just like what those things mean and how they show up in my present day life, and just like how beneficial and necessary mental health and therapy and those types of resources are for the Black community to continue moving forward.
If you were dying tomorrow, what would you leave behind for the youth? What words of wisdom?
Words of wisdom that I would leave behind for the youth would be to be your true self as fully as you can in every space that you can. I think growing up, I was always told like how I needed to look, how I needed to talk, how I needed to perform, the things that I should be interested in. If I loved art, because I grew up loving art and music and reading books and those types of things, I was told that wasn't masculine. Like you needed to play sports, you needed to do this. You would be picked on if you didn't. I would say if there is something that you really enjoy, stand 10 toes in that, and know that there's a space for you there, and make whatever that is that you love doing like integral to your life, whether it be your career or whether that be the thing that just brings you joy outside of work the most that you can invest in. And so, yeah, man, show up as you, whether, however it is that you want to. You see, I got my locks down for today's recording, and that's how I be at work and just waiting for somebody to say something. Because I can come back. I got you in these times and days. So yeah, that's what I would lead to the youth, is just be yourself fully.
Oh, what would I tell them? I would tell them you have the examples. We have the examples. So you can't say you don't know of any. You can't say you haven't seen any. You were looking at one right there. And so hear what they have to say. Find a way to integrate it or add it into your own life, however much or little you want to. And like he said, stand 10 toes on it. Just find what you're willing to lose it all for and hang on to it. Find a way to monetize it and then be the example for the next generation. Like the doctor is for us. And with that, we thank you for joining us on Specificity. Talk to me. What do you think?
Right. Did the recording end?
I hit the end button.
Okay, just asking because I didn't see it.
Yeah. Let's wait. Give it a couple seconds to buffer, and
okay.
I'll trim this out too.
Okay. Man, it's been